The ballroom of the Ashford estate was a cacophony of clinking crystal and forced laughter. My name is Sarah. I'm 34, and for the last decade, I've spent my life in the trenches of the ICU. Tonight, however, I was just the stepsister. I wore a modest, navy wrap dress, something that wouldn't draw an ounce of attention, and tried my best to blend into the expensive floral arrangements. My stepsister, Vanessa, has always had a hunger for the spotlight that borders on a clinical condition. Tonight, she was finally the sun at the center of the universe. She looked breathtaking in a Vera Wang gown that probably cost more than my annual salary, floating through the room as if the golden chandeliers were hanging solely for her. I stood by the entrance for a heartbeat, clutching a small, neatly wrapped gift. I didn't expect to be noticed, and frankly, I preferred it that way. Vanessa and I had grown up under the same roof after my mom married her father, but we lived in two different worlds. While she was being groomed for high society and designer labels, I was working double shifts at a diner to put myself through nursing school. To Vanessa, success was measured in zip codes and Instagram followers. To me, it was measured in the steady beep of a heart monitor. The air in the room was thick with the scent of lilies and the kind of perfume that stays in your throat. Waiters in white gloves glided past with trays of vintage champagne. I found my way to a table near the back, hoping to disappear between a few distant relatives. I watched as Vanessa's new husband, Julian, stayed glued to her side. He seemed grounded, polite, soft-spoken, and completely out of sync with Vanessa's high-octane vanity. About 20 minutes into the dinner service, the room was buzzing. Suddenly, the sharp tick-tick-tick of a silver spoon hitting a champagne flute silenced the room. Vanessa stood at the head table, her eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory glint. "Everyone," she announced, her voice amplified by the sudden hush. "I want to introduce a very special member of the family to Julian's parents." She turned her gaze toward the back of the room. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. I knew that look. "Sarah," Vanessa called out, waving a manicured hand. "Honey, stand up. Come here for a second." The spotlight of 100 eyes shifted toward me. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but I stood up. Refusing her would only create the drama my mother had begged me to avoid. I walked toward the head table, my sensible heels sounding like thunder in the silence. When I reached her, Vanessa draped an arm over my shoulder. Her smile was blinding, but her eyes remained cold. She turned to Julian's family, specifically his father, a distinguished man with silver hair and a gaze like a hawk. "This is my stepsister," Vanessa said, pausing for theatrical effect. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "But don't expect too much. She's just a nurse. One of those useless ones who spends her life cleaning up messes in a hospital." A few people at the table chuckled. A woman in a sequined gown whispered something to her husband and smirked. I felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but I didn't break. I've held the hands of dying men. I've looked into the eyes of grieving mothers. I wasn't going to let a spoiled girl in a white dress rattle me. I simply offered a tight, polite smile and prepared to walk away. But the laughter died out quickly because of the man sitting directly across from me. Julian's father had stopped eating. His fork was suspended in midair. He wasn't laughing. He was staring at me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. He looked at my eyes, then my jawline, as if he were trying to superimpose a memory over my face. "Dad? You okay?" Julian asked, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The older man didn't answer immediately. He set his fork down with a slow, deliberate click. "Yes," he murmured, his voice strained. "Fine." Vanessa, oblivious to the tension, started gushing about their upcoming honeymoon in the Maldives. Private villas, crystal clear water. I told Julian we couldn't settle for anything less than 5 stars. The guests nodded and smiled, but Julian's father remained locked on me. He leaned in slightly, his sharp eyes never wavering. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cutting through Vanessa's chatter. "What did you say her name was again?" "Sarah," Julian answered, looking between his father and me. The man repeated it. "Sarah." He said it like a prayer or a secret. Vanessa laughed again, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Oh, don't worry about her, Arthur. Sarah's not exactly a socialite. She lives in scrubs and hospital cafeterias. Arthur didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes on me. Have we met? You look incredibly familiar. I'm not sure, sir, I replied softly. I work at Heights Memorial. I see a lot of faces. He nodded slowly, the gears turning behind his eyes. Heights Memorial. 3 years ago. Yes, I said, my pulse starting to quicken. Across the table, Julian watched his father with growing concern. Vanessa's smile was beginning to fray at the edges. Arthur, really, she's not famous. Can we get back to the toasts? Arthur ignored her entirely. He rubbed his chin, his gaze distant. I feel like I've seen you during a very important moment. A moment where everything was on the line. The table went quiet. The band started a louder, upbeat swing number, and Vanessa seized the opportunity. Perfect. Time to dance. She grabbed Julian's hand and pulled him toward the floor, the rest of the wedding party following like ducklings. But Arthur stayed seated for a moment longer. He looked at the dance floor, then back at me, the confusion in his eyes slowly being replaced by a terrifying clarity. He stood up slowly, his voice a low rumble. I'm certain of it. We met somewhere where it mattered. I watched him walk away, and for the next half hour, I sat in a daze. I could see him standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching me instead of his son's first dance. He was searching. He was remembering. Finally, during a break in the music, the guests drifted back to their seats, breathless and thirsty. Arthur walked straight to his chair, but he didn't sit down. He looked at me, and this time, the recognition was absolute. There was a raw, emotional weight in his expression that stopped the conversation dead. Sarah, he said. His voice was no longer questioning. It was a command. Yes, Arthur. 3 years ago. November 14th. The night of the blizzard and the transit protest. The memory hit me like a physical blow. The sirens. The red lights. The chaos. I remember. I whispered. Arthur turned to face the entire table, including Vanessa, who was mid-sip of her champagne. 3 years ago, I was in a high-speed collision on the I-95, he began, his voice carrying across the silent room. A pile-up during the Whiteout. I was rushed to Heights Memorial in critical condition. My lungs were collapsing. I was hemorrhaging. The room grew so still you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Because of the protests downtown, the roads were blocked. The surgical teams were stuck in traffic for miles. The ER was a war zone, and they were understaffed. Arthur's eyes welled with tears as he pointed a trembling finger at me. For 6 hours, there was only one person who refused to leave my side. One person who managed my chest tube, monitored my vitals, and kept talking to me, telling me about her life, her dreams, anything to keep me from slipping into the dark. He looked at Julian, who was staring at me with his mouth slightly open. If that woman had walked away for even 5 minutes to help someone else, I wouldn't be standing here at your wedding, son. I would be a memory. The silence that followed was visceral. Vanessa's face had turned a sickly shade of gray. The champagne glass in her hand was trembling so violently that it clinked against her wedding ring. Arthur turned back to Vanessa, his warmth completely evaporated. You introduced her as just a nurse, he said, his voice like ice. You used that word to make her sound small, to make yourself feel big. He looked around the table at the guests who had chuckled earlier. They suddenly found their dessert plates very interesting. You should never say just a nurse about the person who stands between a man and his grave, Arthur said firmly. Julian stood up. He didn't look at his bride. He walked around the table, came straight to me, and took my hand in both of theirs. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I had no idea. Thank you for saving my father. A soft murmur of wow and incredible traveled through the room. The woman who had smirked earlier now looked at me with something bordering on awe. Vanessa sat there, frozen, the useless sister she had tried to bury now the only person the room cared about. I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I looked at Arthur and gave him a small, genuine smile. I was just doing what I was trained to do, Arthur. I'm glad you're here. You did much more than that, he insisted. The band started up again, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. For the rest of the night, people didn't see the quiet stepsister in the navy dress. They saw the woman who held a life together when the world was falling apart. Vanessa stayed quiet for the rest of the night. Her confidence was gone, her perfect moment eclipsed by a truth she wasn't big enough to understand. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't a scream or a scene. It's the quiet reality of who you are finally coming to light. Never let anyone tell you that your work is small. Because when the lights go out and the music stops, it's the useless ones who are left keeping the world spinning. Subscribe to Vengeful Goddess for unforgettable tales of betrayal, resilience, and justice, stories you won't hear anywhere else.